Hi, I'm Alan Corey, and I'm the founder of Time Capsule Ministries. We founded this ministry in order to reenact some of the great sermons from the 19th century. We're working with churches and other living history events in order to bring these to life. Today, we've been working on a series of sermons from the Civil War, 1861 to 1864. The sermon you're about to hear is actually from 1864, and it's a little different than the other sermons because it is a funeral service. It is the funeral of General Leonidas Polk. General Polk was killed during the battles of Atlanta, and he will be utilized by a close friend of his, the Episcopal Bishop of Georgia, the Right Reverend Stephen Elliott. During this message, you are going to learn some things about General Leonidas Polk, his character, some of the things he did. Now, one of the things that people don't know about General Polk is that when he went to West Point to become a military man, he ended up finding Christ and became a Christian during his years there. And so after graduating West Point, he ended up going to seminary and will eventually become an Episcopal bishop. Now, years later, the Civil War started, and he's the Episcopal Bishop of Louisiana, and the Confederate President, Jefferson Davis, will ask him to resume his position and take command and become a general in the Confederate armies, which he does. Some may argue he wasn't the greatest of all the generals, he wasn't a great tactician, but he was consistent in all his military commands. But more than that, he was beloved by his men because he never left the ministry. He continued to be known as the fighting bishop. He ministered to the men in which served under him. Now, he was a slave owner, and that will be brought out into this eulogy. And we may not agree, of course, with slavery. But the thing you have to understand is the time in which this was preached. The thing about Polk's slave ownership is that he preached that slaves should be taught a Christian education, which was unique. And his close friend, Stephen Elliott, will start utilizing him in this sermon, and then you will start seeing his personality coming out, because toward the end, he becomes angry at the North, because of the northern aggression, as he will relate it to it, and he will be mad because they murdered his friend. Now, he will gather himself and conclude with a powerful part of the message. I think as we listen to this message, let us take it with what it was from. It was a historical event that took place, but what are the lessons that we can draw from it that we can apply to our lives today? I hope you will listen to it with an open mind and learn the lessons that God may have for us today. Thank you. St. John's Gospel, chapter 11, verse 28. The Master is come and calleth for thee. God has made everything beautiful in time, and nothing more beautiful than death when it comes to one who has faithfully fulfilled all the duties of life and is ready for its summons. So, such one, a solemn message, the Master come and calleth for thee, has no terror. It is but a long expected announcement of rest, but the long desired ending of the toiled life. The battle has been fought and the victory won, and the war-torn veteran is heralded by the vanquished enemy to the crown of righteousness. And it makes no matter to the faithful servant under the shape or the summons of it comes in the history of the church. The death of its most illustrious saints has taken revolting form of violence, and some have gone to glory with the same shame of Christ, agonizing on the cross. And others have ascended into the gates of paradise in chariots of fire. The spirit of the martyred Stephen passed away amid the curses of an infuriated crowd, And then the gentle James was smitten with the sword of a ruthless tyrant. Why then stand appalled that in these latter days our brother should have died at the hands of violence? Has human nature changed? In the year 1826, we find in the military school of the United States a young man of heroic lineage. He had a fiery blood of the Revolution cruising through his veins. He was of independent fortune, of chivalry, of high noble impulse, preparing himself for the service of his country. He had every qualification to ensure him success as a military man, and every prerequisite to carry him up to a lofty reputation. No one doubts for a moment that had he followed the beck of ambition, he might have risen as a soldier to the very proudest ranks of the Army of the Union. His critics never doubted that he had military traits and character. Upon this young man, thus preparing for the service of the world, Christ laid a touch of His divine Spirit and transformed him into a soldier of the cross. He had work for him to do for his church. The church needed a bold and a fearless man, full of youth and nerve, and plunged into the great wilderness of the Southwest that was teeming as it was with the young and vigorous life of this young republic, swelling and surging under the rushing tide of immigration, and consecrated to the church's service. And she found that champion in this youth, in this military training. The church needed a man of high social position with the carriage of the manner of a gentleman. The church needed a large slaveholder who might speak boldly and fiercely to his peers about their duty to the slaves, and might teach them by his living example that duty was to be fulfilled. And the church found it in this young disciple. He went forth in the power of the Holy Ghost to the earnest fulfillment of his bishopric. He had laid down everything at the foot of the cross. He had stripped himself and his family of riches and of home. He had laid aside for Christ's sake the comforts of domestic life, being separated for months from his wife and children, until at times it was, as Job would say, he was strange to them. Now, when it came to this war, with which we now find ourselves in, I affirm that the complexions of which this war is assumed was known to him long before it burst upon our country. He and I had studied for years the gathering elements. We had analyzed them as companions, and we came to the deliberate conclusion that it was going to be a struggle not which only the state, but the church must do her utmost. Not merely the layman, but also her priest. During the first years of the war, when our armies were in the peninsula of Virginia, he left his diocese upon the Episcopal visitation of those soldiers that were from Louisiana. Having fulfilled that mission, he returned to Richmond just when the federal armies were preparing to sweep down to the valley of the Mississippi and blot out its civilization. A committee of gentlemen were also in the valley at Richmond during that time, and they were beseeching the president to appoint some man whom the people of that vast region could have confidence, and around whom they might rally and defend the preservation. Sidney Johnson, upon whom the president had relied as the commander of the forces of the Southwest, had not yet arrived from California. Beauregard and Joe Johnson were in command in Virginia. Magruder was in the peninsula defending Richmond. Jackson and the Hills and the Longstreets had not yet exhibited their military skill and were unknown to the Valley of the West. The incomparable Lee was engaged in defending the frontiers of his own native state. Hardee was in the service of the state of Georgia. The emergency was great, and the Northwest was gathering all its clans to open the course to the Mississippi to the point which nearly touched its interest. The people of Mississippi, Arkansas, and Louisiana were clamoring for a leader, and unless one was furnished them, might abate their enthusiasm and make but a faint resistance to the invasion. At this critical moment, the president bethought him of this man whom he remembered as a young soldier in the academy, whom he knew as a bishop of the church, whose lofty qualities he had marked all through life, and whose wide and commanding influence in the valley of the Mississippi was well understood. He asked the commissions if Bishop Polk would meet the wishes of the people of the valley. Then arose the important question: can he be persuaded to resume the sword which that he had laid down in his youth upon the altar of God, to use it in their defense? Can it be resumed to the honor of his church with the safety of his soul? For vain ambition, no. For worldly distinction, no. For the preservation of property, or even under the ordinary circumstances, the preservation of life, no. But for the defense of his church, for the care of his sheep, bought with Christ's death, and commanded his charge, for the maintenance of the sacred trust of slavery, yes, 1,000 times yes. The sword that had been laid down at the altar of God for God's glory, and for the glory of God it might be resumed. For the glory of God it was resumed, and it flashed with a celestial brightness in the eyes of the adversary, dazzling and confounding them. And God has blessed that sword upon every occasion of its use. He moved unharmed through the perils of the battlefield, and until his work was accomplished upon this earth, God would call him to rest. No weapon that was directed against him ever prevailed. Now, during his military career, he entered upon that which was like a concentration of energy of will, because he believed it for the time to be the highest duty toward God and his church. When someone did not understand the spirit of his act, was full enough to congratulate him upon the high honor that the president had conferred upon him, his indignant reply would be, "Honor? Honor, sir? There is no honor on this earth equal to the honor of being a bishop in the church of God." And never did he depart from the proper feeling. He felt his military character to be a burden to him. And again, as opportunity afforded, he prayed to be released from its trammels. At Harrisburg, Kentucky, after the bloody field of Prairieville, he said to Dr. Quintard, who had accompanied him on that trip, with deepest emotion, "Oh, for the days when we went up to the house of the Lord and compressed his altar with the voice of prayer and thanksgiving." That's what he longed for. Whenever it was possible during the military career, he surrounded himself with the applicants of the priestly office and rejoiced in them to the bottom of his soul. 2 days before his death, on a Sunday, a storm of darkness, he said to one of his aides, "Everything is dark in nature without, but all is at peace within the house. call all my military family together and let us have a precious service of the church. And he never said the aide, did I see him or hear him more fervent and be more absorbed. It was as if he was being anointed for burial. Time does not permit me to enter into the detail of his long and useful career as a bishop. That must now be left for the biographer, who shall in moments of leisure and peace gather up the threads of this most eventful life and weave it into the narrative, which shall be strange as any fiction. Born to a large hereditary estate, he increased that fortune by intermarriage with a noble woman that he had loved from his boyhood and who has cheerfully shared with him his Christian pilgrimage. He has died leaving his family without shelter or dwelling place, wanderers from the pleasant home which they knew in their childhood and their youth. But his work is done, and now he rests from his labors. That brave heart is quiet in the grave, and that faithful spirit returned to God. And now, ye Christians of the North, and especially ye priests and bishops of the church who have lent yourself to the fanning of the fury of this unjust and cruel war, do I this day, in the presence of the body of this murdered brother, summon you to meet in the judgment seat of Christ, that awful bar where your brute force shall avail you nothing, where the multitudes whom you have followed you to evil shall shield you from an angry God. I summon you to the bar in the name of the sacred liberty which you have trampled upon underfoot, in the name of the thousands martyred saints whose blood you have wantonly spilled, in the name of our Christian women who you have violated, and in the name of our slaves who you have seduced and then consigned to misery. There I leave justice and vengeance to God. May God have mercy upon you in that day of solemn judgment and of fearful retribution. Oh, friends. And now let us commit this sacred dust to the keeping of the Church of the Confederate States until such time as his own diocese shall prepare to do him honor. That day will come, I see it before me in a vision, when this martyred dust shall be carried in triumphal procession to his beloved Louisiana, and deposited in such a shrine as a loving and mourning people shall prepare for him, and shall rise, then receive the prophet's reward. His works shall rise up from the ashes of the past and attest to his greatness. A diocese rescued from a brutal dominion of the effigies of his blood. A church freed from pollution by the vigor of his counsel. A country made independent through the devotion and self-sacrifice. And university sent forth streams of pure and sanctified learning from his exuberant bosom. Generations made better and grander from his example and his life. Rising up, they will call him blessed. Let us pray. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen.